Good morning, everyone. My name is Ray Barger, and I would like to share with you my little bio about leaving Leatherwood. First of all, let me tell you a little about myself. Of course, I was born in Bowlingtown, Kentucky on Leatherwood Creek. Moved to Lexington in 1942. I was drafted into the Army in 1953. Spent 25 years in the Army, served in several countries, including Korea, and last of all, in Vietnam. I retired in 1977, having obtained a degree in physician assistant and was a certified physician assistant. I went back to school and got a degree in health education, a master's degree from Eastern Kentucky University. Worked as a health educator in a hospital in Tennessee until I retired from that. And now I live alone in the little town of Summertown, Tennessee. So let me share with you my little story of leaving Leatherwood. First of all, you need to know about the creek. To say that the creek was a special place would be a giant understatement, because it was so much more than just a special place. The creek was home. The creek was a familiar friend. The creek was both a school and a playground. The creek taught a willing child independence, courage, resourcefulness, and many more essential elements of character development. It provided swimming pools in summer, skating rinks in winter, fishing holes year-round, and it was an ever-present daycare for children young enough to enjoy and old enough to play safely. The creek originated way up the valley, where a couple of branches ran down hollers and joined together at the bottom, then continued on down the valley. Other branches joined the flow, and from there all those branches became the creek. The creek was never silent. It babbled and giggled and chortled and laughed as it leaped over rocks and logs, tree limbs, over sandbars, around bends. All of those happy sounds were a symphony of contentment and a nightly lullaby for folks living along its banks. There were some deeper pools in places as the creek drew nearer to the river. In those pools could be found some good-sized fish. Fish like perch, suneye, catfish, something called hog mollies, as we called them then. Even an occasional bass could be seen swimming along the gravel bottom. Those deep places were also occasionally used for baptisms by the only church on the creek. I loved that creek. I knew every rock, every deep place, every shady place, every sandy place, every fun place where a kid could play all along that part of the creek that ran by our house. My mother told me of a time when we were living in the weaning house and I was about 3 years old. I wandered out of the yard and down through the cornfield to the creek. I was over the bank and out of sight from the house. When Mom looked for me and didn't see me, she called loudly from the back porch, "Ray Jr." Ted, our black and white collie dog, who never left my side, heard Mom call and ran up the bank and barked, saying, "Don't worry, Mom, I got him." After we moved to Lexington, I returned every summer to spend most of my summer vacation with my grandma in the big house where the creek runs into the Middlefork of the Kentucky River. At that time, I was a little older and a little bigger, so I spent more time in the river than I did on the creek. The river. The Middle Fork of the Kentucky River originated near Hyden, Kentucky, and confluenced with the North Fork down near Betaville, Kentucky. There were shallow places in the river called shoals, where it could be forded if there was a crossing road. My grandparents' house was located at one of those shoals where Leatherwood Creek ran into the river and where Leatherwood Road crossed the river. The deeper places between the shoals were usually good fishing holes where a variety of fish could be caught with net, trot line, or cane pole. No one there had fancy fishing tackle, but managed to catch a lot of fish with simpler methods and equipment. In winter, the river froze over, and the ice provided a good skating and another method of fishing. In the shallower places, fish could be seen under the ice, and by striking the ice over the fish with a large hammer or a rock, the fish would turn belly up and then chopped out with an axe. Many of the Barger children and grandchildren loved to skate, and there was a pile of skates available in the little cubby hole under the stairs at the house. I remember my father taking me to school on skates with me on his back. But the river could be very dangerous during spring runoff from heavy rains and resulting flooding. Many times the water would back up our creek almost to the house. Aunt Rachel's house was occasionally flooded and the family had to evacuate. Came to our house in the middle of the night. Their kids, my cousins, were tucked into bed with me and Richard, with the girls at one end of the bed and boys at the other. The grown-ups stayed up, watched the creek rise. In an effort to deal with the flood problem, a dam was built at Buckhorn, Kentucky, backing the river up for a long way upriver. Many of the old home places, including ours, ended up at the bottom of the resulting lake. Although the lake provided control of flooding and a beautiful recreation area, many people lost their homes and, more importantly, their connection with their beloved hills and hollows. The road. I suppose if the road had a name, it would be the same as the creek, Leatherwood. If someone should say, "I'm going up Leatherwood," that would mean he's going up the road as well as up the creek. You can't go up one without going up t'other. The road started where it left the big road by Uncle Matt's on the other side of the river. It went down a long lane from Uncle Matt's to the river. At one point along the lane was an old apple tree that had the sweetest apples I've ever tasted. They were a late apple, so there were still apples on the tree when we started school in September. We would fill our pockets full of apples on our way to school and play apple core, Baltimore, all along the way. The road crossed the river at the shoal where the river was shallow enough for a vehicle to ford across. There were also stepping stones for anyone on foot. The stones were a long step for adults, but for us kids, we usually just waited if the water wasn't too deep. It was always a big job to replace the stepping stones after a flood because they were usually moved out of place by the high water. There was also a boat to use if the water was too high to use the stepping stones. In earlier times, the boat was controlled by a pulley system to pull the boat back and forth across using a long rope. That system was occasionally washed out by high water during a flood and later not even replaced. Many times, travelers on foot would have to call across to my grandparents' house for someone to bring the boat. When I was there, I would eagerly run down to the road, down to the river, throw the chain into the boat, and shove off to paddle across to the other side. It was not a rowboat, but was propelled by a paddle by someone sitting in the back of the boat, like a canoe or a pirogue. Sometimes the boat would have to be retrieved from the other side by someone willing and able to swim across the river. With so many children and grandchildren around, it was almost never a problem to find a willing person to operate the boat. From my grandparents' house, the road went up the valley past the store, past the barn, past the corn crib, past the shop, and past the tobacco barn on the hill above the road. The first house after Grandpa's was the weaning house. It was called the weaning house because it was where newly wed children lived until they could build a house of their own. All of my grandparents' children received enough land to establish a homestead when they got married. It was enough land to have a small farm and a house, and enough livestock to live and raise a family. I and my brother Richard were born in the weaning house and lived there until I was about 5 years old. Then we moved up the road to Burnout Branch. The next house up the road from us was where my Aunt Rachel and her family lived. My memory of the road from there on up the valley was a little fuzzy. I seldom traveled up the road beyond Aunt Rachel's house. Aunt Alpha, Aunt Elsie, Aunt Pearl, and their families lived farther up the road, but I never went that far on my own. There was a small community on up the valley from Aunt Pearl's called Saul. There was a little church building at Saul where we attended services when a traveling preacher would come through. The church building was used for school, and my mother taught school there for a couple of years. When I was a baby, we actually moved to Saul so Mom could be closer to school. Before we moved, Mom rode a mule all the way from the weaning house up the road to Saul and back every day. The road was rough, rocky places, sandy places, and when it rained, those dusty places became very muddy. The only traffic on the road was horseback and an occasional horse-drawn wagon. Uncle Ford had a small truck which he drove up the road when he had some business to attend to further up the road. I never saw an automobile on the road. It was just too rough. My grandfather had an old Model T Ford, but got rid of it when he got older. Beyond Saul, the road connected to another road that ran down another valley to Buckhorn, Kentucky. The road provided a challenging place to run a click and wheel. The click and wheel was one of my favorite toys and pastimes. The wheel was a steel band from a nail keg or from the keg that horseshoe rods came in. There was a band on either end of the keg and a larger band in the middle. When the keg was no longer needed, the bands could be removed and used for kids' play. The click was a length of heavy gauge wire with a U-shaped curve on one end and folded to make a handle on the other. The wheel was pushed along the road in the U shape at the end of the wire. That's very difficult to describe. Just a note about the kegs. Grandpa had a fully equipped blacksmith shop with the ability to repair and, in some cases, manufacture farm equipment. Of course, so many horses and mules, a lot of horseshoes were needed. Those horseshoes and nails came in wooden kegs. When empty, they were valued by moonshiners for aging whiskey, so I'm told. Grandpa was very much against moonshine and did all he could to discourage the practice. So he tried to burn the empty kegs to prevent them being used by moonshiners. After burning, all that was left of the kegs were the heavy steel bands, which he hung on a peg in the shop. My cousin Vernon told me about how the kegs were used. I have no first-hand knowledge, you understand. The hills. The hills were actually ridges which ran in a confused pattern throughout the mountains of eastern Kentucky. The tops of the ridges were relatively free of undergrowth, making them a good place for a trail. It was an exhilarating experience to go running along the ridge at the top of a ridge. I was a ridge runner. I loved to run as fast as the terrain permitted and pretend I was flying. It was also a very pleasant experience just to lay on my back with my head on old Ted's belly, listen to the breeze singing through the treetops, Ted's panting, making my head bob up and down, matching the beating of my heart as I lay recovering in the cooling shade of some favorite tree. When the river and creeks were flooded and the roads not passable, the ridges were the only way out of those hollers. During one frightful night of one such flood, we were afraid the water would get up into our house. So my mother took me and Richard up the hollow behind the house to the top of the ridge. Aunt Rachel and her children had come to our house since we were further from the flooding creek. Altogether, we climbed to the safety of the ridge top by lantern light and walked the ridge top all the way down to the hollow near my grandmother's house and down behind her house to the safety of her upstairs porch. The men were all gone, floating log rafts down the river to sawmills, probably at Ravenna, Kentucky. In those days, it was common practice to tie logs together into large rafts and wait for the spring flood to float the logs downriver to a large sawmill operation. In the valleys between the ridges, the morning sun appeared over the ridgetop around mid-morning and disappeared behind the ridge on the other side in mid-afternoon. In those narrower valleys, the days could seem pretty short. It could also make the winters seem a little colder. The family. William Barger was the son of Sam Barger and Sally Davidson Barger. Sam was killed by someone associated with the KKK. Sam Barger was the son of Jesse Barger, who was the son of Abraham Barger. William Barger married Rebecca Hensley, whose parents were Klang or Klingman and Rachel Hensley. Klang's father was Robert Hensley and Rachel's father was Ben Hensley. William and Rebecca had 12 children. From the oldest to the youngest, Ford, born in 1897, Alpha in 1900, Manon, 1902, James Madison, or Matt, 1904, Rachel, 1906, Howard Taft, 1909. Howard died in 1911. Ray, 1911, Elsie, 1913, Hubert, 1916, Pearl, 1918, Violet, never learned her birth date, and William Jr., born in 1923. Their sixth child was a boy named Howard, who died at age 2.5. Their next child was my father, Ray, which made him the middle child with 5 brothers, 5 sisters, 5 older, 5 younger. When Dad was called up to service in the Army, he assumed the name Howard as his middle name to honor his brother who died. William Barger made his fortune in logging and lumber along the middle fork of the Kentucky River at Leatherwood Creek and for a good way up the creek. He owned most of the land from the mouth of Leatherwood Creek to the community of Saul. He also owned a general store where he sold a normal range of goods from a small country store. When Grandpa died in 1938, I think, my father bought the store from my grandmother for $600. Dad operated the store until we moved to Lexington. Grandpa helped many families through the Depression by selling them supplies on credit. Most of those debts were never repaid. When Dad took over the store, he continued to sell on credit, never demanding payment. The kid's life. I was born in the Weaning House on 17 October 1932 with the help of my grandmother and the nurse from the Frontier Nursing Service. When it became apparent that I was on the way into the world, Dad rode the mule first to tell Grandma, then on across the river to the nursing station to tell the nurse. The nurse was the only woman I had ever seen who did not wear a dress. She wore riding breeches and polished black boots. Her only mode of transportation was a horse, which she rode astraddle like a man. My earliest memories are of life in the little house just up the road from my grandparents, the Weaning House. It was a small 2-room house, log house, with a front porch that ran across the length of the house. The roof was made of wooden shingles, or shakes. I still recall scenes of my dad using a tool called a froe with a mallet to split shingles to repair the roof. In the larger room was a large sandstone fireplace, and I remember Dad sitting in a chair on the hearth, drilling holes with a hammer and star drill in those large sandstone blocks to attach the iron fixtures to hang pots over the fire. Like everyone else at that time and place, we had no electricity, no natural gas, no running water, no indoor toilet, no telephone. My grandparents had a telephone at one time, but the wire was usually down somewhere, so it was never dependable. The house was heated by means of a fireplace in one room, which burned wood and coal. In the other room was a cook stove, which usually burned only wood. Everyone had an outdoor toilet, with an old copy of the Sears Roebuck catalog or a supply of corn cobs. Coal was readily available in the hills, so there was never a shortage of fuel. The store was equipped with a heating stove where we burned wood and coal and always had a warm fire going in winter. The weaning house was the nearest house to Grandma and Grandpa's. When one of their children married, they lived in the weaning house until they could build their own place, thus the name Weaning House. Richard and I were born there, I in October 1932, Richard in March 1935. My grandparents owned several hundred acres of land on the Kentucky River and quite a way up Leatherwood Creek. When a son or daughter married, they were given enough acreage to have a small farm, but if no house was there, they lived in the weaning house until a home could be established. We lived there until 1937. Uncle Hubert, Aunt Marie moved in there when we moved out. They were the last couple to live there and occupied the weaning house longer than any of the other children. All of their children were born there, and they were among the last to leave Leatherwood. When Dad and Mom married, they were given a strip of land just up the road a little way from the weaning house. It was about 45, 50 acres. Ran from the top of the ridge on one side of the valley to the top of the ridge on the other side. The place was called Burnout Field, probably because of a wildfire sometime in the past. The holler behind the house was called Burnout Branch, and the holler on the other side was Muley Buck Holler. There was a new 3-room house there where we lived until 1942. Wayne Scott was born there in 1941. Up Muley Buck Holler away was a rocky hillside field, just about an acre or two, which Dad planted in corn every year. And oh, how I hated that place. So many of my summer days were spent there hoeing corn. My grandfather, William Barger, operated the store where he sold a variety of general store items from feed, flour, coffee, hardware items, other necessary staples, which people needed to live in the hills at that time. That typical old country store was the unofficial meeting place where men of the community cussed and discussed the affairs of the day. They were sometimes referred to as the Spit and Whittle Club because most of them chewed tobacco and whittled while they solved the problems of the world. During the Depression, my grandpa sold food staples and other necessary supplies on credit, which helped so many families make it through those hard times. Most of those debts were never repaid. After Grandpa died, sometime around 1938, Dad bought the store from Grandma for the grand total of $600. Dad borrowed the money from Uncle Kurt, Violet's husband, with our farm as collateral. That debt was never repaid, so the farm became the property of Kurt and Violet Dixon. Dad operated the store while continuing to operate the farm at the same time, which was a strain on everyone. That was only possible with the help of my great uncle, Frank Barger, who was Grandpa's brother, lived up the road a ways from us. Uncle Frank became one of my favorite people in the world. He was a gentle old man who frequently stopped by on his way from the store to talk and to drink a water from our well. He walked all the way from his home further up the creek to the store where he helped Dad and and minded the store when Dad had other work that had to be done. Dad operated the store until 1942. Mom taught school at the little schoolhouse at Salt, Kentucky. We called it the head of Leatherwood at that time. She rode a mule from the weaning house up Leatherwood Creek to school and back every day. After I was born, she had to take me along with her. About that time, we moved to Saul so it would be possible for her to continue teaching. I'm not sure just how long we lived at Saul, but I know that when my brother Richard was born, Mom had to give up teaching, and we moved back to the weaning house. I'm getting a little tired, so bear with me. When I was about 5 years old, we moved from the weaning house up the road a short way to Burnout Field at the mouth of Leatherwood Branch. There was a fairly new house there on 40 or so acres, received from my grandpa. The house had 3 rooms, 2 larger rooms with a chimney between, and a smaller room at the end of the house. A front porch ran across the front of the house. I have so many wonderful memories of that front porch. There were always chairs on the porch, chairs made by an old man, Eli Turner, who lived a good way up the road somewhere near Saul. Passers-by were always invited to get down and sit a spell. Visitors were rare and very much appreciated. So when it was time to go, the traditional invitation was, "You might as well just take a night with us." Our well was deeper than most and was well known for its cool, refreshing relief. Dad and I would sit for hours on the porch and sing those old gospel songs that were so well known in the Kentucky hills. Dad was not very religious, but he sure loved to sing those old songs and taught me to love them too. My youngest brother, Wayne Scott, was born in that house in July 1941. I know I'm repeating some things in this little biography, so I beg the listeners' patience with the way my memory works and the way I choose to record it. School attendance was more voluntary than mandatory at that time in that place. Many parents believed that 7 was too young for children to go to school, so it was not unusual for kids to start at age 8 or even 9. Because many families depended on the children to help with farm work, it was not unusual for kids to be absent from school during critical farming activities throughout the year. Tobacco was the only money crop for those families that were able to obtain a tobacco base. I'm sorry about that. The tobacco base was the amount of acreage a family was allowed to grow in 1 year. The cat just had to get in the story. Later, it was changed from acreage to poundage. Our tobacco base was 1 8/10 acres. For us, the annual income from the sale of tobacco was around $500. In today's economy, that doesn't sound like much, but for us, a good year in tobacco meant a new pair of shoes and maybe some new clothes for everyone in the family. Tobacco farming was a year-round occupation. It began in early spring with burning the beds. Making a seed bed required a large pile of brush and wood, which was burned till there remained only a pile of ashes. This pretty well sterilized the ground so the tobacco seeds had the best possible chance of germinating and growing to healthy plants. The bed was lined around the edge with logs and covered with cheesecloth attached to the logs after seeds carefully saved from the previous years were sown in the prepared bed. After the seed bed was finished, it was time to prepare the field. This was done by turning the ground with a turning plow, smoothing it with a drag, then laying it off in rows with a single-shoveled plow commonly called a middle buster. Some extra weight was always needed on the drag, gladly provided by Richard and me. This work was all done with a mule pulling the plows. Laying off the rows required some skill and a lot of coordination between the mule and the operator. When it was time for the plants to be pulled from the seed bed and planted in the field, it was all hands on deck to quickly get the plants placed in the ground. Planting always required a rainy day, so the ground was soft enough to pull the young plants from the bed and be planted. From the time I was 5 or 6 years old, it was always my job to place the plants in the ground. Dad walked along the rows carrying an armload of plants, dropping a plant about every 24 inches along the prepared rows. I followed on hands and knees, making a hole in the soft earth with one hand, placing a plant in the hole with the other. Then I packed the earth around the plant and moved quickly to the next plant. The work of raising a crop of tobacco continued on throughout the summer until cutting time, usually in September. The special technique of cutting the plants, attaching them to a stick, and hanging them in the tobacco barn would require more time and space than I care to spend here. Maybe this is just a little more information about tobacco farming than most people want, but since it was our only source of income and it occupied so much of our life, I feel justified in describing in a little more detail. The tobacco barn was a large structure built especially to house tobacco plants where they could safely hang to dry. There were tiers of rails about 5 feet apart and about 4 feet between tiers. Large barns could have up to 5 or 6 tiers, making the top rails very high above the floor and dangerous for a 9-year-old kid to work there. As a teenager, I worked on a few tobacco barns around Lexington and Georgetown and was usually assigned to hang the sticks on the top rails. Each stick held 5 tobacco plants and could weigh about 40 pounds. The sticks were passed up from the wagon, tier to tier, all the way to the top. In one corner of the barn would be a small room with a window, a wood-burning stove, and a workbench. It was the stripping room, where the dried tobacco plants were taken to have the leaves stripped off and tied up in small bundles called hands. The hands of tobacco were carefully stacked on round pallets, then loaded on the truck for transport to market at Winchester, Kentucky, I think. The tobacco barn was a special place for us kids. Since there were no stalls for animals and no hay and no manure smell, it was a great place to play on rainy days. In summer, when there's no tobacco hanging there, we would play marbles on the dirt floor or climbed around on the rails playing tag or catch me if you can or just plain hanging out. The barn was also a favorite place for a barn dance. All that was needed was a fiddle and a guitar and someone to call the sets, and the square dancing would continue well into a Saturday night. There was usually a fruit jar of moonshine hidden outside where some of the men would go from time to time for a little liquid encouragement. And of course, visits to that little brown jug usually caused bad feelings to erupt into all-out fighting and even a stabbing or shooting. Aunt Alpha's first husband, Dudley Barger, was shot to death at one of those dances. Dudley was Vilene's father. When I started school at Bowlingtown School, which was down the river about a mile from Leatherwood Creek, my teacher was Pauline Barger Bowling. She was Uncle Ford's oldest daughter, and of course my cousin. She taught grades primer through 4, and her husband, Gib Bowling, taught grades 5 through 8. Most everyone in that school was related to either Bowlings or Bargers, and a few were related to both. School was about a mile walk from our house by either one of 2 routes. One way was by way of the county road, which was across the river from Leatherwood Creek. To get to that road, we had to cross the river by boat or over stepping stones in the shoal of the river. The other route was down by way of a path that led from Grandpa's house down the river to a swinging bridge. When possible, we crossed the river at the creek and down the county road, which was the shortest way. Aunt Rachel and Uncle Wallace and their children lived up the road from us a short distance. My cousins Jeanette, Vernon, and Audrey walked with me to school and back every day. After Richard was old enough for school, he walked with us also. The school was two rooms, with a small cloak room built into each room. In winter, coats were hung on pegs in the cloak room and lunches were stowed on shelves there. In summer, lunch was usually eaten under the school building where the kids sat around, eating on the dirt floor and ate our lunch together there. For most of us, lunch consisted of leftover biscuits with a piece of meat on one and butter and jam on another. When there was not enough meat, the biscuits were sometimes just dipped in grease or even spread with lard. Apples and other fruit, when available, were always a welcome staple for school lunches. There were no paper bags and no plastic of any kind. So biscuits were usually wrapped in a small towel called a tea towel, which were cared for and returned to Mom in the lunch bucket. The lunch bucket was always a small lard bucket. Life was not easy in those days in the hills of Kentucky. While I lived there, I was, for the most part, oblivious to the work and worry of day-to-day living on that small farm. We depended completely on the land to provide all the necessities of life. The few usable acres we had was carefully managed and worked to grow enough food to feed 3 kids, Mom and Dad, a cow, a mule, chickens, a hog, a dog, 1 or 2 cats. A few essentials could be purchased at the little store, but money was very scarce and there was no employment to provide income. A good garden was, of course, the key to survival. We had a good garden, some fruit trees, chickens, and a cow that kept us alive. A good year in the garden and fields meant we ate well. A poor year meant going to bed a little hungry sometimes. We grew enough corn and hay to feed the mule, the cow, the chickens, and the hog through the winter, and enough cornmeal for cornbread to feed the family. We shelled corn to take across the river to Will Gay's mill, where it was ground into meal, which Mom used to make cornbread every day. Cornbread and biscuits were the only bread I ever tasted until we moved to Lexington. We also raised a hog or two every year to slaughter in the fall. Hunting game was also a source of food for many folks there in the hills. There was an abundance of rabbits, squirrel, possum, other edible critters around which we hunted occasionally and enjoyed eating. But Dad was just too busy to do much hunting, so an occasional rabbit or squirrel, when we could get it, was a treat for us. Every boy had a good slingshot, which could be used to kill a rabbit or a squirrel if he was good enough. We had a shotgun and a .22 rifle, which I could shoot very well, but was never allowed to take out by myself to hunt. After we moved to the city, I usually spent summers with Grandma. She would sometimes ask me to go out with her shotgun to get a squirrel. I had only limited success, so I never considered myself to be a great hunter or even a good hunter, but I loved to try. With no refrigeration, game had to be prepared and eaten right away. Since we lived on a creek near the river, fish also provided an occasional meal. My Uncle Jr. and a couple of older cousins fished with a net and a trot line in the river, sometimes shared their catch with us. Fried fish was so delicious. I like to try to fish in the creek by our house, but with very limited success. A willow limb with a piece of string and a bent pin just did not make very good fishing tackle. Entertainment was as simple as our life. Reading, crafting, conversation were the most important pastimes for adults, but for us kids, there was usually no problem finding something to do, especially in the summer. Of course, there was a lot of hard work, but when the work was done, we had the creek and the woods and the river as our playground. We were always tired in the evening, so going to bed early was never a problem. Before Richard got old enough to play, there was just me and old Ted, so I spent a lot of time alone. Ted was good company, but not a very good conversationalist, since his vocabulary was so limited. But he was a good listener, and what little I spoke, he seemed to understand. When Richard was old enough, he and I spent a lot of time exploring the then-known universe, which, by the way, became much easier and more fun when we received a bright red Flyer wagon for Christmas one year. Mom and Dad liked to play cards and spent many Saturday nights playing with Uncle Hubert and Aunt Marie. Their favorite game was 5-Up, and sometimes lasted well into the night. When they played at our house, Richard and I were sent to bed early, and we listened to their fun until we drifted off. When they played at their house, we went to sleep on a pallet on the floor and was carried home after the games were done for the night, Dad carrying me and Mom carrying Richard. Usually Saturday nights were spent at Grandma's, listening to the Grand Ole Opry on her big radio. We sometimes listened to Renfro Valley Barn Dance, which came from Mount Vernon, Kentucky, at Renfro Valley. It was so much fun to sit around on the floor with the cousins, laughing and singing along with our favorite artists and songs. Later, probably around 1941, we ordered a small radio from Sears. It sat on a table with a large battery on the floor. It had to have a long antenna, which we called an aerial. It ran out to the pole by the well. We like to listen to I Love a Mystery and One Man's Family and others that I can't remember. As strange as it may sound, baseball was a pretty big thing in those days in the hills. Many communities had an organized baseball team. There was no league, no organized schedule, but teams would visit other teams on invitation and spend a Sunday afternoon playing baseball and enjoying dinner on the ground. I never heard the word picnic till we moved to the city. Dad played center field and was one of the best hitters on the team. He loved to brag about his home runs, stolen bases, spectacular catches. He spent a lot of time teaching me to play the game. And once when I was catching his pitching practice, a fastball that just tipped the top of my mitt struck me fairly on the nose. My face was a bloody mess, and Mom was very angry. Almost put a stop to my baseball career. It was at a baseball game in Bowlingtown that Black George Barger, stabbed a man to death. He ran away out west somewhere and was never caught. The story has been told and retold so many times that the true facts will probably never be known. At the last Barger reunion I attended, I asked Uncle Jr. what he knew about it, and he said that he was there, witnessed the whole affair. According to Jr., the man killed was one of the Hacker boys and played on the opposing team. The man hit a home run and was running down third base line when Black George became so angry, he stepped out and stabbed him right on third base line before he reached home plate. I've been told that the Hackers tell a different version of the story. They said it happened a long time ago, but Junior assured me that it could not have been long ago, or very long ago, because they didn't even play baseball in Bowlingtown until after the war. World War I, that is. Both Dad and Uncle Ford seemed reluctant to talk about it, so maybe I shouldn't either. One day in mid-December of 1941, I was at the store helping Dad with a few chores around the place. While I was sweeping the porch, someone came running up the road from the river and seemed very excited about something. He practically ran into the store and in a loud voice asked, "Y'all heard the news?" I dropped my broom and ran in to hear what news he was talking about. "The Japs bombed Pearl Harbor," he announced. There were a couple of men sitting around the stove. Dad was behind the counter. Everything got suddenly very quiet. Then someone asked, "What's Pearl Harbor?" Of course, I wanted to know that too. Also, what are Japs? I soon was to learn the answer to those questions, but so many more needed answering. One thing was certain, though, my life was about to change. Little did I realize at that time just how great that change would be. My memory of that last year on Leatherwood is so patchy and confused that I really can't say much about it. I know there was a lot of anxiety and confusion about what was happening in the world, but even more so about what was going to happen to our family. The draft kicked into high gear as men were called into the armed forces, shipped off to training camps miles away from home. Even though Dad was temporarily deferred because of having 3 children, he knew he had to be prepared to leave for service at any time. So plans were made for disposal of the farm, disposal of the store, moving the family. There was no way Mom could take care of everything by herself. We just could not make it there without Dad. So we had to move to a place where we could live while Dad was gone. It was finally decided that we would be better off in a larger city than we would be in Hazard. Opportunities for Mom to find work were much better there, and available places to live were more plentiful. Dad went to scout out houses where we could afford to rent, and found a house on the north side of Lexington, near the edge of town. It will be our address for the next several years. 107 Fairlawn Avenue. The last few days before moving were hectic and confusing, to say the least. We had no idea about what to expect in the city of Lexington. I had been to Hazard only one time in my life that I can remember, and then for only a short time. Mom had been to Berea and Richmond to go to school, but never to a city as big as Lexington, which had about 35,000 people there. We were excited to see different places, distant places, but mostly very much afraid of the unknown. We didn't have much furniture and took only what we thought would be essential for living in the 3 rooms and a bath to which we were moving. The only vehicle available to use for moving was Uncle Ford's ton and a half truck. It was loaded with 2 beds, a wardrobe, a chest of drawers, a table, a few chairs, and except for clothes and a few personal items, that was the load. A young girl from up the road came and helped Mom with packing and getting ready for the move. I think her name was Cassie. Can't remember her last name, but she had been one of Mom's students at the school up the road in Saul. Finally, the morning came for us to leave. I will not try to describe my feelings and anxiety I felt as we were all finally loaded into the truck. Dad was driving. Mom sat in front with the baby. Wayne was a little more than a year old. Richard and I found places to sit or lay in the back of the truck. And as the truck pulled away from the house and turned down the road, I was looking back at Cassie, waving goodbye, and old Ted, looking confused, sitting beside her. Cassie turned around and started up the road, and Ted slowly turned and followed her. We turned the curve at the gap, and the last view of home was gone. The tears, the lump, the wrenching feeling in my chest, all screamed at me I was leaving Leatherwood.